They say it's better to debate a question without settling it than to settle a question without debating it.
Quite right, Anshika. Did you know that the history of debating can be traced back to ancient times, such as the debates in ancient Greece in the 18th century? Debate is a great activity for students of all academic levels. It helps build confidence and skills in speaking in public. Namaste, and a very warm welcome to all the participating teams, our esteemed judges, and all watching online. My name is Myra Obhan.
And I am Anshika Bindal, and we are your hosts for today. Today is special as we bring the 17th Junior Shri Debate 2021 online. Even though there's an ongoing pandemic and the debate is online, we refuse to let that stop us from debating and having fun. Because after all, debating and divergence of views can only enrich our history and culture. They say debating was born when warriors put down their sword and started to use words.
The pen will always be mightier than the sword. The power of the sword results in destruction and loss of life, whereas the power of the pen creates awareness and motivates the readers. The sword can conquer only through fear, but with the pen you can conquer the hearts. Debating is an essential tool for developing and maintaining democracy and open societies. It helps build persuasive and critical thinking and encourages our minds to deeply analyze a topic given to us. The participants reasonably argue and respectfully discourse.
We start today's proceedings with the lighting of the lamp, which is regarded as a homage to knowledge. The flame of the lamp always burns upwards, which signifies that one should obtain knowledge in a way that uplifts oneself to do higher deeds.
The school spirit is strong in all of us. The essence of every school anthem is to rouse the spirits of the children and uplift them. Not only this, it enthuses them with pride for being a part of an institution which makes them hold their heads high. Before we proceed, we would like to share our school song with all of you.
Pehli sad
An ever-inspiring song. The Shri debate will be judged by an extremely distinguished panel of judges. Let me introduce you all to the judges for today's competition. Mr. Sukumar Ranganathan, Ms. Sonia Singh, and Mr. Prakharaja Fukin.
Mr. Sukumar Ranganathan, editor-in-chief of the Hindustan Times. He is also the founding editor of Mint, which started in 2006, and he edited between 2008 and 2017. He has previously worked in leadership roles at the Hindu Business Line and Business Today. Mr. Sukumar has degrees in chemical engineering, math, and business administration, and is interested in mathematics, science and technology, the history of business, new media, and data-based political journalism. He, in his free time, reads and collects comic books and is an amateur birder. Thank you for taking the time out for us, sir. We're honored to have you on the panel.
Thank you.
Ms. Sonia Singh. In a career spanning over 3 decades, Ms. Sonia Singh has covered news events that have defined not only contemporary Indian history, but also global politics. Ms. Singh has interviewed various world leaders, including Hillary Clinton and numerous Nobel Prize winners, such as His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Shri Kailasatirthi. She won the ENBA 2015 award for Editor-in-Chief of the Year. Ms. Sonia Singh is a primetime anchor and journalist who currently serves as the editorial director and president of the NDTV Ethics Committee. Welcome to the panel, ma'am. We're honored to have you.
Thank you. That's one of the sweetest introductions I've ever got. So thank you both very much.
Mr. Prakharaja Fukin is an entrepreneur based out of Guwahati, Assam. He is the founder of Northeastern U, a marketing and advertising agency, and the managing partner of Pratarka Educational Services. He was the vice president of his debating society in college and has participated in many national parliamentary debates as an adjudicator and a debater. Thank you, sir, for joining us. We're honored to have you. The participating teams for Junior Shri Debate this year are the Sanskriti School, the Doon School, the Shriram School Aravali, the Shriram Millennium School Noida, Shiv Nadar School Gurgaon, Vasant Valley School, Delhi Public School Vasant Kunj, Scottish High International School, and the Shriram School Malsari.
Welcome teams and best of luck. I'd like to call Manisha ma'am, principal of Senior School Mulsari campus, to welcome our guest and speak a few words.
Namaste and a warm good morning to all of you. On behalf of our director, Mrs. Manika Sharma, and the staff and students of the Shri School Mulsari, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome our esteemed judges, all the participants, and the teachers accompanying them to the 17th Junior Shri Debate. Welcome, everyone. This is an event all of us at TSRS eagerly look forward to. I know some of you students may be a bit disappointed that it is online. We did wait a long time, but I think given the times, safety is very, very important. I'd like to begin by quoting William Penn. In all debates, let truth be thy aim, not victory or an unjust interest. That should be something that underlines all that you do today. Debating an issue requires us to keep an open mind, children, understand different perspectives, and separate facts from opinions. As we know, it's about convincing or winning the other through logical and cogent arguments and facts. Here, words of Rumi, I think, should guide all of you. Raise your words, not your voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder. Thus, let the teams, which are all charged up and I know waiting, put their skills into building strong arguments. Debate in the spirit of knowing the truth and respect your opponents. I know today's topic is so very relevant in this world, and all of you should learn to speak up when there is a wrong. Wherever you may be, whatever you are doing, we have to raise our voice against the wrong. That's the only message I want to give you. All the best to each one of you, and may the best team win. Thank you.
Thank you, Manisha ma'am. Anshika and I now invite Uday Chopra, Secretary of the Shri School Malsari's Debating Society and the moderator for this year's Junior Shri Debate, to introduce the topic and take the proceedings forward.
Thank you, Anshika and Myra, for the introduction. Once again, I would like to welcome all of you to the 17th Annual Junior Shri Debate. Let me now walk you through the rules and regulations of the competition. This competition is only open to students of classes 6, 7, and 8. Each team will comprise of 2 speakers. One speaker will speak for the motion and the other shall speak against the motion. Each speaker will speak for 3 minutes. They will be given 1 additional minute to rebut the previous team. A warning bell will be played 30 seconds before the allotted time, and 2 bells will be played when the time is up. Personal attacks, slang, and vulgarity will be severely penalized. The judge's decision in all cases will be final and binding. The topic for the Junior Shri Debate 2021 is, there should be no restrictions on freedom of speech. And now, moving on to the debate proceedings, I would like to invite the first speaker, Anika Gopal from the Sanskriti School, to speak for the motion.
Good morning, teachers and my fellow debaters. My name is Anika Gopal and I am representing Sanskriti School in favor of the motion, there should be no restrictions on freedom of speech. In 399 BC, a philosopher of the ancient world was put to death, sentenced by his peers on the charges of corrupting the youth and worshipping false gods. The real guilt of Socrates was that he questioned the thoughts that had become forced on the citizens of Athens. He spoke freely about religion, logic, rituals, and even love. At the time, this was unacceptable to the powers that be. Today, Socrates is revered as one of the greatest philosopher teachers in history, and his techniques have made their way into classrooms all over the world. Those who stood against free speech were the ones who delivered hemlock to the great man, much like what they intend to do today. For several centuries, the very concept of someone holding a different view or a belief became the basis for war, bloodshed, and plunder. The possibility that a religious faith is not shared led to heretics being stoned to death. To postulate that the world was round was met with scorn and writing about unrequited love could lead to years in jail. Why, even 100 years ago, in this very city, there would have been no chance of a debate of this nature taking place among Indian children, and even less of the debaters being girls. The only reason that we are where we are today is because of free speech. Free speech with no limits that exhorted a nation to resist. Free speech that broke a colonial yoke as it emerged from the mouths of Jinnah and Patel and Gandhi. Free speech that allowed generations of mothers and wives and daughters to chip away at the misogyny of our society. If, as our opponents suggest, there were to be restrictions on free speech, we are leaving the judgment of what is right and wrong entirely upon the people of today, without either learning from the mistakes of the past or making allowance for the wisdom of tomorrow. The beauty about free speech is that it makes the world a marketplace of ideas. Without limits, there is free trade in human imagination, which can only make the world a better place for science and art and culture. To bridle this is to bridle evolution itself. Speaking of evolution, see where we are now. In a single day, there are 40 billion posts on Instagram, 75 billion on Facebook, and 5 billion snaps on Snapchat in one day. If the age of social media has taught us anything, it is that free speech is the way forward, and to even attempt to control it would be an exercise in futility. For years, women have been told that it is not ladylike to be loud or to express oneself freely without limits. Today, I do want to be ladylike. Thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker for their great speech and invite Anvesha Singh from the Sanskriti School to speak against the motion.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Anvesha Singh from Sanskriti School, and I'll be speaking against the topic, restrictions on freedom of speech. How would you have liked it if I had begun with vulgarities and slang, calling out names of my fellow colleagues and how awful they had been? That's not allowed, you say? Why, I wonder. Some might point out that it leads to unnecessary provocation, or it goes against the norms of public decency, or that it might hurt the sentiments of others. Exactly, and that is the point of having restrictions on absolute freedom of speech. Do you remember the character Thanos from Avengers and his words of wisdom? Perfectly balanced as all things should be. Though he himself did not abide by this, our constitution makes sure that we do not overstep the boundaries of decency and public order and tries to maintain a balance between what can be said and what should not be in Article 19 of Part 3. Now, right at the outset, I would like to emphasize that I talk of balance, and therefore I understand the sanctity of freedom of speech. It's just the absoluteness of it that bothers me. If the human world driven by our bounded rationality and passion, there's no space for absolute. We all exist in a spectrum of various hues. It would be a utopia where we are allowed to speak our minds as we wish. But in the same utopia, one must remember, others too will have the same right. Are you then prepared to endanger your dignity and your beliefs at the behest of someone else's fancy of mind? What I'm proposing is that as intellectual beings, we humans can develop a certain level of tolerance against being offended, which is necessary too. We cannot let anything and everything offend us. That would restrict speech entirely. What we need is to identify our limits. I'm criticizing someone's work in a constructive way. That is completely all right. In fact, it leads to higher standards of work. But I'm speaking out on someone's personal choice, maybe their dress or appearance, which is entirely none of anybody's business. That is where we draw the line. Here, a very contentious issue of group sentiments also rises. We see rising intolerance against speech that is directed towards the community's belief system. How do we find our limits in this case? Should we stop questioning the belief system at all? That is out of the question. A society can only develop when its norms are challenged. If nobody spoke against slavery or gender inequality because it might hurt religious sentiments, imagine where we would be now. So we need to have freedom of speech to question certain practices that fall out of time. But the distinguishing feature is the intention of such questions. Is the speech directed towards the community as a bona fide attempt to bring change? Or is it a malicious way to achieve some other ends? Therefore, Taslima Nasreen's freedom of speech is justified, but mob shouting outside a mosque, "Mandir wahi banayenge," is simply outrageous. I cannot imagine anything in nature that is entirely unrestricted. An absolute is an attribute only thought of belonging to God. However, even that is disputable. Therefore, an attempt to bring such absoluteness in social context is nothing short of a folly. Thank you.
For the Sanskriti school, the first speaker, Anika, spoke for 3 minutes and 7 seconds. The second speaker, Anvesha, spoke for 2 minutes and 55 seconds. I would like to thank the speakers for their speech. Inviting Yashvi Chugh from the Shri School, Aravali to speak for the motion.
What is freedom of expression? The right to freedom of expression allows individuals to express themselves in their way. But how can we say that we have freedom of speech if there are restrictions imposed on it, if we're not able to express ourselves honestly and say what we actually want to? What is freedom of speech? Without the freedom to offend, it ceases to exist. Namaste. I, Yashvi Chugh, from the Shri School, Aravali, am speaking for the motion that there should be no restrictions on freedom of speech. Words are more than just words. A single word has the power to instill hope, inspire, collaborate, metaphorically move mountains, and change world history. Gautam Buddha, the founder and religious leader of Buddhism, said, "Words have the power to both destroy and heal. When words are both true and kind, they can change the world." With that, I state my first point. Words have the power to build nations and empires, but how will they be able to do that if there are restrictions imposed on them? The birth of the United States of America and the American War of Independence was partly due to the verbal protests against the unjust and discriminatory laws aimed at the colonies in America. Not only did these protests foster the birth of a great democracy, but also sowed the seeds for the questioning of racism, a fight that continues to this day. Freedom of speech has been used very effectively, and history is dotted with these examples. Some of the best ideas are born in the worst situations, the most personal of those being the questioning of British rule by the Indian freedom fighters. This brings me to my second point. Freedom of speech brings about good changes in society when it questions regressive traditions and religious beliefs. It gives us the right to question archaic ideas and reform. The movements of Renaissance and Reformation, which took place between the 14th century and 17th century in Europe, brought about a massive change in society, affected by the Renaissance thinkers who were rationalists. They asked people not to blindly follow the corrupt practices of the church and question beliefs founded on blind faith and superstition. The new spirit of inquiry opposed the practices of the church. We have also witnessed that some tall leaders such as Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Henry VIII were the leaders of the Protestant movement and spoke out against the church, for they believed it had become too powerful, rich, and corrupt. These were the people who brought about change and made the world a far more inclusive and tolerant place. This work is currently in progress. Freedom of speech gives everyone the freedom to voice their opinion and concerns. This is very important for the advancement and betterment of our world. Thus, I think there should be no restrictions on the freedom of speech. It is morally incorrect to stop somebody from expressing their opinion. I would like to conclude by quoting George Orwell, an English novelist, journalist, and critic. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. And that is how progress is ignited. I thank you. I would like to rebut the previous speaker, Anvesha, from the Sanskriti school. Thank you for your speech, Anvesha, but I would like to contradict one of the points that you made. You said there should be restrictions on freedom of speech. However, there shouldn't be restrictions when you're questioning old beliefs and traditions. I'm pretty sure that in the 14th century, when people questioned the church, it was wrong. It was wrong to speak out against the church, but that didn't stop them. So how do you know if, it cannot be called freedom of speech if there are restrictions on it, and if you're not able to express yourself truthfully. If you are of a view that goes against the government, you will not be able to express yourself in public honestly, as many countries do not allow you to speak against the government. So, in conclusion, freedom of speech cannot be called freedom of speech if there are restrictions imposed on it, and you will not be able to put across your views and opinions truthfully. Every noble act in this world can be used by people with bad intentions, but that shouldn't stop us from trying to attain progress. Thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker for their spectacular speech, inviting Kavya Miglani from the Shri School, Aravali, to speak against the motion.
What is freedom of speech?
It is the fundamental right that allows every citizen to articulate his or her opinion and ideas without any fear of retaliation, censorship, or legal sanction. I believe that this right must not be absolute. Words are very powerful. They may not seem so at the start, but just an instance of verbal bullying or inciting can have serious repercussions, such as insecurity, poor cerebral performance, serious psychological scars, and even depression in some cases. Hence, I would like to begin by saying that freedom of speech should exist, but with certain restrictions imposed upon it. Namaste. I, Kavya Miglani from the Shri School at Ravli, am going to speak against the motion that there should be no restrictions on freedom of speech. History is full of instances which have seen the ill effects of people crossing the limit of free speech. My first assertion takes you to the genocide in Rwanda, which took place in 1994. A few years before the genocide took place, the leaders of the Rwandan government started inciting the Hutu tribe in Rwanda into exterminating the Tutsi tribe. They did so by using false, dehumanizing, and hate speech against the Tutsis, likening them to cockroaches and declaring them as threats to society. The leaders of the government were successful in doing so just 5 years later, which led to the mass extermination of over 3 lakh Tutsis in just a span of 100 days. So many lives could have been saved if the leaders of the government were restricted from spreading false information against the Tutsis in the first place. My second elucidation is the Khalistan movement in Punjab, which violated our nation's sovereignty. Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, an extremist religious leader, gave inflammatory speeches and campaigned violently, inciting people for the creation of a six-state and armed occupation of the Golden Temple complex in Amritsar and wanted to run a parallel government. The campaign was against the sovereignty of our nation and cannot be considered as a freedom of speech. For these reasons, he was finally neutralized in Operation Blue Star in 1984. Restriction-free freedom of speech assumes a responsible and thoughtful population and assumes a committed political leadership, an assumption that is both naive and flawed. Given the reality of the world we inhabit, I would be wary of such blanket rights. In this digital era, there are so many social media platforms through which we can express ourselves, so it is all the more important to exercise restraint. I would like to contradict the concept of freedom of speech without restrictions. For example, in our nation itself last year, unfortunately, the East Delhi riots took place solely because there were no restrictions on freedom of speech. So much bloodshed, property destruction, and financial damage could have been prevented if restrictions and taboos were imposed upon it. Restrictions upon this right will nowhere prevent us from expressing ourselves because they will be made keeping in mind what is best for the majority of the population. I would like to end by saying that as a right comes with responsibility, freedom comes with restrictions. Thank you.
The first speaker, Yashvi, spoke for 4 minutes and 23 seconds. The second speaker, Kavya, spoke for 3 minutes and 37 seconds. I would now like to invite Amira Kher from Vasant Valley School to speak for the motion.
In a country of almost 140 crore people, we're bound to all have different views and opinions, yet opposition would rather suppress them than listen to them. Good morning to the House at last. Today, I, Amira Kher, will be strongly proposing the motion there should be no restrictions on freedom of speech. I will be mentioning the context, stakeholders, and 3 arguments which support my stand. Coming to the context, what is freedom of speech? Freedom of speech is the one main fundamental right mentioned in our constitution. It is the power or right each citizen has to expressing their opinion on any subject without censorship, restraint, or legal penalty. What is meant by the motion is pretty much the same, that we mean that every single citizen has the right to express their views and opinions. Coming to the stakeholders in this debate are the members of society and the nation's progress as a whole, which will be severely impacted if the right to vote one's opinion is snatched from them. Now, our argument. My first argument is that putting restrictions will suppress the views of people. India has a vast population. All citizens with different opinions and views of freedom of speech is the one thing that allows our citizens to express those. By putting a restriction on this right, we're limiting and defeating its sole purpose, which is to allow people to speak what they believe in. The interpretation of an opinion depends on the listener, whether good or bad. Thus, each opinion is important and should not be suppressed. Putting on restrictions will just lead to violence and protests. Are we forgetting how we fought for our freedom? Now, coming to my second argument. This solely stops development. We need to realize that opinions and views on any subject is one of the main things in lawmaking when it comes to a democratic country. As an opinion, as I mentioned, whether good or bad, helps in bringing in change which leads to development. If side A gives their views on one subject, the government listens to them. If side B gives their opinion and views against the subject, the government listens to them as well and then decides what is better for the majority. This process, which has freedom of sharing one's view as its backbone, is what helps in forming laws. And laws are the one thing that help in the progression of society. So if we're putting a restriction on certain topics, we may be eliminating that one side that might as well be wrong, but could have been the reason for the government to understand that the other side was right. For example, if no one would have opposed homosexuality, the government would have never understood the importance of giving rights and making homosexuality legal. Now, coming to government misuse, we need to realize that if this power is given to the government, it would be very easy for them to make rules that are in favor and help them out. Governments can easily use the term restrictions to suppress the view of society if they're not in their favor. This would completely lead to a leadership instead of a democracy, and where all we're doing is blindly following rules and living in the opinions of one person/ruling party, since we cannot speak up on subjects. It is important for us to understand that the freedom of speech is one thing that allows us to speak up against our ruling party, and if the government were to put restrictions on it, it would rob us of our rights for change of expression. I would like to point out that there are some restrictions on freedom of speech right now as well, which is why when comedians like Veerdas come with two India's concept, they are opposed for it. They are fed with lawsuits because when they actually speak up about what's happening in our country, it is supposed to be wrong. Now, coming to my rebuttals. The previous team very well stated that there are hate speeches that are being said, there are people being racist, there are people being homophobic, there is bullying. But they also added the entire idea of social media, which is my rebuttal themselves. That yes, hate speeches are there, yes, racism is there, but people on social media are educating these people to stop doing that. Just because a few people are being wrong, that does not mean you can take away the right of speech from others who are trying to oppose them. We need to realize right now that once we take away the idea and we take away the entire idea of freedom of speech, when we're of course stopping hate speech, we're stopping racism, we're stopping everything that is wrong, but we are also taking away the right to speak, the right to oppose, the right to say the truth, the right to say what they feel from innocent people. To end my speech, I would like to say that we all live in a society where murders happen every second, rapes happen every second, people are robbed, and all sorts of crimes happen. So should we stop stepping out? Should we stop owning things? Should a girl not step out of her house? No, right? So even if there are hate speeches and racism, should we completely stop the right to speak? Thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker for their speech. Inviting Veda Kalra of Vasant Valley School to speak against the motion.
As Dr. Mahathir Mohamad once said, freedom of speech is not a license to abuse, it is a responsibility. Good morning, respected chairperson, members of the jury, and my worthy opponents. The motion before us states there should be no restrictions on freedom of speech, and I'm extremely proud to oppose. In my speech today, I'll be doing three things. Firstly, contextualizing, providing burden, and defining the motion. Secondly, stating and elaborating on two constructors. And thirdly, rebutting the proposition. Now, freedom of speech refers to openly expressing one's point of view through not only words, but also actions. Restrictions refer to limits. When speech has no restrictions, the world will be a place where hatred is spewed, people put to the altar, and harassment is justified. Without limits, people can belittle and say anything, incite hatred against homosexuality, Jews, minorities. Is this the world the proposition wants? Hence the need for sensible limits on speech, where you cannot simply put a stake through people by saying what you want, by belittling, by discriminating. Panel, on our side of the house, we believe in expressing opinions, but in a healthy way, where there are limits, where people respect values, differences, and perspectives. Our burden is that it is immoral and unethical to not have restrictions on speech, when untrammeled speech can cause harm and hatred and marginalize others. Here are a few reasons why there should be restrictions on freedom of speech. Firstly, without restrictions, hate speech will be encouraged. If restrictions are not there, stereotypes, hate, discrimination, bullying will be the norm and justified. For example, in India, or even in America for that matter, we have a constitution with articles that restrict hate speech against marginalized communities to avoid such discriminatory behavior. Hate towards a person or community refers to discrimination on the grounds of religion, caste, gender, nationality, and so on. For instance, till the 1950s, Dalits were subject to vile abuse and discriminatory speech and actions. That changed with restrictions. Today, one cannot speak and act with hatred against others from different religions or ethnicities. Remember, India's strength is its multi-ethnic societal fabric. Similarly, there are restrictions in a sensible society against abusing and vilifying gender. Secondly, without limits, unrestricted speech will harm societies and countries. Healthy democracies with extremely stable constitutions will soon become anarchies and dictatorships, as citizens, of course, without restrictions, will force a majoritarian view. What prevents me, the majority community, from restricting your right to pray, to vote, to work, and to love? All in the garb of freedom of expression. Hence the need for restriction through laws and statutes. Moving on to propositions case. Panel, I'd like to flag post here that proposition has done nothing but elaborate on the fact that we're denying people freedom of speech and suppressing views. What we are doing is putting sensible limits that do not divide countries and societies. Proposition is not even bothered to think about what the world will look like when these restrictions aren't there, failing to realize that in a world where there are no limits on speech, relationships will be torn, and even discrimination and inequality will be justified. Now, proposition presented two main arguments, none of which stand. Firstly, I'd like to clarify that today our constitution has articles that ban discrimination, etc. The first argument they mentioned was about the power of words, something which they said in their context can be damaging too. If we restrict freedom of speech, words can be used positively, bringing a positive change instead of us using words to divide us. Secondly, they mentioned that freedom of speech helps express. This loops back to something I'd already rebutted in my speech. They mentioned that speaking against governments would not be permitted. Again, like I said, we put sensible limits that stay true to the essence of a democracy. Panel, I'd like to say that we are not denying freedom of speech. We support speech with restrictions against hatred and divisiveness. This harms individuals, communities, and nations. Thank you.
I would like to thank both speakers for their speeches. The first speaker, Amira, spoke for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The second speaker, Veda, spoke for 4 minutes and 15 seconds. I would now like to invite Kai Kubo from the Doon School to speak for the motion.
A painter should be free to paint what he wants, and a writer should be free to write what he wants. I believe that this same ideology should also apply to freedom of speech. Very good morning to honorable judges, respected chief guests, and all the audience. Today, I myself, the proposition of today's topic, will justify this. Firstly, to keep in mind, for a speech to be considered freedom of speech, the speaker must hold accountability to understand if their speech meets moral ethics and respects the human dignity of free speech. And secondly, if their speech has the aspect of legal justice in order to be correct. To analyze further, we must understand and take notice that the term speech is categorized into two different types, which are hate speech and free speech. Although they both deal with the expression of thoughts and feelings, they both have different characteristics. Hate speech does not ought to mean free, as it is against human dignity, and ethics. It is deemed to be impolitely offensive. On the other hand, free speech shows dignity and morality that follows ethics. In further depth, hate speech incites harm or violence against others and does not respect the opposing person. Free speech, however, allows people to discuss their beliefs, thoughts, and ideas openly, while at the same time aiming to respect the dignity of those individuals. If we don't categorize the different types of speech, then there ought to be confusion and complexity, where individuals will not be able to agree upon a standard. Thus, freedom of speech means free speech instead of hate speech. Secondly, freedom of speech is a basic human right in all societies, and it plays a vital role in the lives of people, especially when a democratic country's minister takes decision for society, like India. The people of India have been guaranteed by the Constitution. Freedom of expression is a fundamental right enlisted in Article 19. There is a provision for it, and that is how the people have been brought up to believe that they are free to express themselves and they are free to say how they perceive. It ensures that the people are able to discuss, exchange, and debate ideas. Freedom of speech allows the citizens of the country to express and share their views openly without any restrictions. The public can openly criticize the government if it doesn't work in the favor of the people. It secures the right to speak and write openly, along with the ability to criticize any injustice. Thirdly, I believe that curtailing the right to freedom of speech in certain ways and in certain aspects could be problematic, because then that's taking away the certain fundamental rights that we've been guaranteed, as I had said before. Speech allows human beings to communicate their thoughts and emotions. Words allow us to express our feelings, to realize our ideas, to push frontier boundaries of intellectual exploration. Words can move hearts, words can change perception, and words can set nations and people in powerful motion and, expression. To limit freedom of speech and expression is to cripple the basic right to realize our full potential. Sometimes such a discord may lead to social unrest, which as a result can disrupt a society. In freedom of speech, it is not always possible for everyone to be happy. I do take notice of that. It's possible for a person's feeling to be hurt, but that is because using your freedom of speech is necessary to disagree with another person's opinion. Coming to my rebuttal, the previous team of Vasant Valley School is arguing that such freedom of speech should be silenced, but I feel that they are arguing more about hate speech rather than freedom of speech. The idea of freedom of speech supports the freedom of an individual or a community to articulate their opinions and ideas without fear or censorship. Through speech, one can convey his feelings, thoughts, sentiments to others. Freedom of speech, sometimes referred to as freedom of expression, is thus a fundamental right which a human being receives by birth. Everyone has the right to freedom of speech and expression to impart information and their own ideas. And with that, I would now like to rest my case. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the speaker for their outstanding speech and invite Harshal Markin from the Doon School to speak against the motion.
Just imagine you're an immigrant in a certain country. You've lived there for a long time. You have a stable job and a happy family. But a certain politician doesn't like immigrants and he delivers a hate speech against them, using some of the worst racial slurs and stereotypes, hurting your feelings. Due to that hate speech, laws on immigrants get stricter. You don't get the same respect as you used to. There's a newfound discrimination towards your people, and you can't go back to your homeland due to the fear of not being able to come back, causing families to be torn apart. And whether you like it or not, some amount of dignity and self-respect for your own people, culture, and ethnicity is lost. Now put yourself in that immigrant's shoes and tell me honestly, would you want that speech to be given out and it not being stopped due to the sole reason of that person expressing his right to the freedom of speech and due to there being no restrictions whatsoever? This, ladies and gentlemen, leads me to my first argument that people forget that while expressing their own rights, that through ways like hate speeches that are caused by free speeches, they are curtailing your rights, and not stopping actions like these do not make us come out as smart. They make us look oblivious, unfeeling, and plain old stupid. And after all of the things I just said, it is pretty evident that if we do not put certain restrictions on freedom of speech, it will cause major problems, one of them being hate speeches. Now, let me clear up a few things from my argument. Firstly, what is free speech or the freedom of speech? This is when a person can speak whatever he wants without the fear of being stopped. And secondly, what is hate speech and how does freedom of speech lead to it? So simply put, hate speech is anything that a person says which gives birth to any form of hatred towards a certain person or community. And freedom of speech contributes to it because those people can speak whatever they want without the fear of being stopped. So they don't even give thought to whether what they are saying is principally right or wrong, in the process hurting countless innocent lives. We can see this in the past as well when in India, hate speeches were delivered against people eating beef in 2017 to 2018 from people like Sadhvi Saraswati. And these hate speeches in some way or form caused for the innocent lives of the people who weren't even violating any law at that time to be lost. And this was honestly disheartening to see since again, no action was taken against the people who gave out the hate speech just because of their right to the freedom of speech. There are numerous other examples from hate speeches against immigrants by Steve Bannon to the hate speeches against Muslims on Facebook. And all of them had the same horrendous outcome, proving that there need to be some boundaries. I'm not saying that people should be stopped from spreading their opinions. People should spread their thoughts and opinions and exercise their right to the freedom of speech until they are stopping or curtailing someone else's rights or hurting other people, at which point a line should be drawn. And for this, I would like to use an analogy. It goes, you have every right to close your fist and swing it as hard as possible, as long as you don't hit someone else. Now, another problem is sedition, which is when a person by words, whether spoken or written or otherwise, brings attempts to bring into hatred or disaffection towards the government. And this also is caused due to no restrictions on the freedom of speech, ladies and gentlemen. When you speak against your own government, it portrays your own country in a bad way. So during that precious time where the government should be developing a country without any hindrance, now their trustworthiness is questioned by other countries, harming international relations and other people as well. An example of this can be seen when the former United States President Donald Trump spoke against the common Democratic government of Joe Biden, and that caused the United States Capitol to be raided by Trump supporters, causing unnecessary trouble and damage to people as well as infrastructure. I am not saying that a government shouldn't be criticized. Constructive criticism always helps a country progress, but unnecessary criticism, which actually incentivizes people to go against the government, is just not right. It is hard to say that we need limitations. No one enjoys being told what they can and cannot do, but we need some restrictions to protect the safety and honor of the people. Otherwise, there would just be anarchy. There comes a time where the priority or even an obligation for the government to ensure the safety of the citizens, and even if that means having to limit the freedom of speech. Now for the rebuttal. I would like to rebut the proposition of the previous school. When they say that it is not the interpretation that matters, but the meaning, that's just not right. Because what's the point of the meaning if the interpretation is completely disregarded, since ultimately decisions are made from the interpretation of the speech, like in the parliament as well, is the interpretation that leads to the policies being made, not the plain old meaning. When the proposition says that people are being suppressed, I would like to quote my speech itself. I am not saying that people should be stopped from spreading their opinions. People should spread their thoughts and opinions and exercise their right to the freedom of speech until they are stopping or curtailing someone else's rights or hurting other people, at which point a line should be drawn. When the proposition of the previous school implied that we need to let humans live like they want to, I need to remind them that they are ultimately humans. They are not gods. They can make mistakes which lead to hate speeches, and ultimately they can do things which in an impulse which is not right. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the excellent speech. The first speaker, Kaya, spoke for 3 minutes and 50 seconds. The second speaker, Harshal, spoke for 4 minutes and 27 seconds. I would now like to invite Udavir Khosla of the Shri School, Moulsri, to speak for the motion.
Social media has brought upon a revolutionary change to the methods that we use to communicate. And the usage of social media has only skyrocketed with lockdowns around the globe. It's given people the ability to propagate whatever they want to whomever they want to. This communications revolution has once again brought up many questions and discussions about the restriction of freedom of speech. I, Udavir Khosla, firmly propose unrestricted freedom of speech and expression, which is something I will elaborate on throughout the course of my arguments. Removing all restrictions on freedom of speech means that individuals should be allowed to freely express any thoughts or expressions without any fears of being clamped down upon by the government. I'll go on to present 3 arguments explaining why I support unrestricted freedom of speech. First, freedom of speech is a fundamental right and it is critical to the functioning of a democracy. Second, the applications of restrictions of speech can be misused to suppress common people. And third, restrictions on freedom of speech put hate speech behind closed doors, making it harder to tackle. I'll move on to my first argument now. Freedom of speech is a fundamental right. The act of restricting freedoms and curbing power of people stagnates the growth of a democracy. For a democracy to function, there has to be a constant flow of ideas. But when you restrict freedom of speech, this flow of ideas becomes inconsistent, and ideas against the ruling government begin to get filtered out. Democracies rely on a balanced opposition that proposes contrasting ideas. But with the removal of this opposition, the structural integrity of a democracy is fractured. This means that democracies decrease their rate of evolution and might end up reverting to regressive ideals that oppress large portions of society. Now, frustration with ruling parties can be suppressed under the pretext of restrictions on propaganda and misinformation, and democracies will begin to become more and more autocratic by the day. This is a scary Orwellian reality. Now onto my second argument about the applications of restrictions of speech. These restrictions on freedom of speech can be applied in an obviously biased manner. This means that authoritarian governments can now use these restrictions to oppress their citizens. Criminalizing dissent and very harsh sedition laws will lead to little to no accountability on these governments. This essentially leads to politicians bending restrictions to create a massive power imbalance, which leaves activists in jail for simply taking a stand. Now onto my last argument about hate speech. It's evident that hate speech exists on either side of the house, but on side proposition, hate speech is out in the public. Why is this better? At the point at which you restrict hate speech, it moves from the public domain into a private discussion. And when it exists behind closed doors, it remains unregulated and unchecked. This means it gains the potential to cause actual physical violence against targeted communities. But when hate speech is out in the open, on the other hand, these targeted communities can be given protection. Because when hate builds up behind closed doors, it gains the capacity to unleash itself at any moment, which makes it a much bigger problem. So to conclude, restrictions on freedom of speech violate the sanctity and fracture the structure of a democracy. They can be misused to suppress voices, and they make hate speech an even bigger problem. Now, on to my rebuttals. My opponent made many claims about sedition, but I have a question to ask him. What is wrong with portraying your country in a negative way? Why should you not be allowed to point out the obvious flaws in your system? If a system is corrupt, The idea should be to fix it. If you are against the government, it is your absolute right to stand up against it. Because what is a democracy if not a government run by the common people? What nation that suppresses concerns about governance can call themselves a democracy? He claimed that no sedition would lower a country's foreign image, which makes international relations even harder. But isn't being seen as a tyrannical, autocratic country more harming for your reputation? Thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker for their fine speech. Now inviting Zunaira Hussain from the Shri School, Malsari to speak against the motion.
Two men beaten to death over the circulation of false social media articles accusing them of being kidnappers. Then the US Capitol stormed after a political leader used Twitter to incite violence in his supporters. This is the power that speech has. And now, with so many different forms of communication, it is more important than ever for us to restrict absolute freedom of speech. Today's motion is about whether all of us should have the right to express any thought or ideology, no matter how insular or dangerous, without any repercussions. And I, Zunaira Hussain, strongly oppose this. Freedom of speech is a human right. However, it is important for the government to have the authority to restrict certain types of speech. Speech that is discriminatory, inciting violence, or spreading misinformation should be restricted. To be clear, speech that peacefully expresses political disagreement or expressions should not be restricted. I have two constructive arguments in my debate. My first argument is on fake news, and my second argument is on hate speech. Starting with fake news, if we don't restrict freedom of speech, we could be allowing the circulation of factually incorrect information. The spread of fake news can have a huge impact on the lives of individuals. For example, during the first wave of COVID-19, where there were an average of over 2,000 people dying each day, false information about masks being ineffective led to thousands of individuals not following the correct protocols to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Then during the second wave, there were gang members who spread misinformation and duped people on the pretext of delivering medical oxygen cylinders, making a windfall for themselves at the expense of people's lives. The point is that false news doesn't only poison political debate and discussion, it takes lives. And it would be the biggest failure of the government if they didn't intervene to protect vulnerable and naive citizens. Moving on to my argument on hate speech. While freedom of speech is a human right, so is the right not to be discriminated against. And discrimination is exactly what hate speech is about. No person deserves to be discriminated because of their background, skin color, or religion. Furthermore, hate the existence of discriminatory language, hate speech can also impact the ability of entire communities of individuals to feel safe in their homes. For example, military personnel in Myanmar used Facebook as a tool for ethnic cleansing. They used this platform to spread hate speech, which accumulated into large-scale violence and hate crimes being inflicted upon the Rohingya community. This resulted in tens of thousands of people killed, over 25,000 raped, and by 2018, 700,000 refugees fled abroad. Now, I would like to conclude by pointing out one thing. I'm sure most of the participants read the rules and regulations of the competition, referring to the fifth rule, which states, personal attacks, slang, and vulgarity will be severely penalized. Isn't this also a restriction on freedom of speech? And a restriction there for good reason. Now, moving on to my rebuttal. My worthy opponent mentioned that free speech is a basic human right. However, so is the right not to be discriminated against. And when you allow free speech, discrimination comes with it, causing problems for ethnic minorities. Then my opponent also mentioned that not everyone is happy with free speech, and that's okay. He said that people can disagree, but I find this narrow-minded. What happens when people disagree violently? We lose our sense of productivity in the discussion. It is important to restrict violent speech to maintain a certain level of dignity and conduct in society. Does a violent anarchy really sound like a free world to you? My worthy opponent also mentioned that it can put a strain on creativity. However, we are not absolutely restricting freedom of speech. We are simply restricting speech that can harm the country and negatively affect groups. And with this, I conclude my debate.
I would like to thank the speakers for their speeches. The first speaker, Udavir, spoke for 3 minutes and 58 seconds. The second speaker, Zunaira, spoke for 3 minutes and 57 seconds. I would now like to invite Naman Sonpar from the Shri Ram Millennium School, Noida, to speak for the motion.
Let me present my views freely to those who are steadfast and brave. Let my words echo across the land, a right that we value and hold so dear. May my words be uttered without reprimand, speaking emphatically, free from fear. Namaste, everyone. I'm Naman Sonpat, and I will be speaking in favor of the topic there should be no restrictions on freedom of speech. The Constitution of India gives every citizen a right to freedom of speech and expression, which is defined very clearly under Article 19(1)(a). It means everyone has a right to express their views or thoughts in the form of speech, writing, or printing. As responsible citizens, we must use our right with caution. The greater number of restrictions put on the public, the greater number of people will tend to rebel. If people are given unrestricted access to speech, it is their responsibility to use their right with caution. Allowing them to speak with n number of restrictions will only instill fear in the public, resulting in a suffocating silence before the storm. Problems like corruption, concern over public safety, and facilities provided by the government affect the common man. If man is not allowed to disagree with detrimental policies, the real problem will neither be highlighted nor be solved. The unrestricted right to freedom of speech is particularly important for journalists and other people working in the media as well. They must feel free to criticize the government, their policies, matters regarding the safety of the individual as well as the nation without the fear of prosecution. This is a vital feature of a democratic society. Although a small fraction of citizens in such a large country might use the public platform to make provocative statements, causing unrest amongst the public. There are special forums formulated especially to look into such matters and hold those individuals accountable. However, such actions of a handful of people should not result in restrictions on the speech of the general public, as curtailing that would be the end of democracy. Another way to ensure that people exercise this right responsibly is by including the learning of social etiquette and social behavior in schools. Programs like eCube, Student Advisory Program, or SAP session stress upon empowering and uplifting others. If social etiquette and social behavior is taught to children at the right age, it will help them grow into mature and responsible individuals. I would like to end my speech with the quote, "Life without liberty is like a body without spirit." We will be able to progress as a society, as a country, and evolve as a civilization only when everyone's say is heard, reflected upon, and implemented. With respect to the views of my worthy opponent, I would like to bring to your notice that I have already mentioned in great detail as to why it is important to have no restrictions on freedom of speech and how it will help us grow as a democratic republic. While I acknowledge the set points, I would like to say that Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel used diplomacy, mediation, and his right to speak to get the various states into the Indian Union without any bloodshed. Hence, giving everyone a right to speak freely, which will help us individuals grow and will help the country grow. Thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite Ahana Chopra from the Shri Millennium School, Noida, to speak against the motion.
Namaste. I'm Ahana Chopra, and today I will be speaking against the motion there should be no restrictions on freedom of speech. There's a very famous saying, with great power comes great responsibility. And what is the absolute freedom of speech if not great power? When someone has the freedom of speech, they hold the power to make statements, to influence people, to affect them for the better or the worse. And when someone has that much power, it is very easy to get drunk on that power. They feel almighty. They start making mistakes, misusing their freedom and disregarding the fact that their words can have dire consequences. Restrictions, parameters, these are nothing but the checks and balances that ensure that the freedom we have is being used in a responsible way. We must remember that words can hurt. They can cause strife. They can adversely influence people, and they can even cause war. Let us take an example. Social media. The many social media apps that we use today are very big platforms where we can express ourselves, our thoughts, and our opinions freely. We can say whatever we want to say to anyone we choose to say it to. And because of this unlimited freedom, the most hurtful things are being said on a regular basis. through posts, comments, tweets. People do not feel a sense of responsibility while exercising their freedom of speech in public. If everyone was always polite, always peaceful, always respectful, maybe then we could have had absolute freedom. But that's not the case, because we live in a world where people are verbally bullied, abused, harassed on a regular basis, and that is why restrictions are necessary. As they rightly say, prevention is better than cure. In today's times, we rely more on the internet than on anything else. And so, checks and balances are a must in order to prevent the widespread of misinformation. Already, people talk more openly about their fears and apprehensions than they do about something positive, and this negatively impacts others. They just add their fears onto the existing conversation, and the result of this is utter chaos and widespread misinformation. Centuries ago, Mark Antony stood over the body of Julius Caesar and used his freedom of speech to move the public to rebel against his killers. The result? All hell broke loose in Rome, leading to war. So, the freedom of speech cannot be underestimated, and misusing it can cause disaster of the greatest magnitude. Like I said before, freedom of speech is power, and without any restriction, those in power can very easily misuse their freedom. Your freedom cannot infringe on someone else's, because if it does, it's no longer a right, it's an imposition, and we must remember that. Now, moving on to my rebuttal. My worthy opponent mentioned some very valid points, and while I acknowledge them, I would like to say that with there being so many different religions, beliefs, and different cultures all across the world, which are all very sensitive topics for a vast majority of the people, it becomes difficult for those exercising their freedom of speech to know where to draw the line and how far to go before saying something offensive. The way I see it, imposing restrictions to prevent something bad from happening is much better than waiting for something to happen and then holding people accountable for it. And while it's not possible to please everyone, because it's not, with the help of restrictions, it does become easier to not end up hurting someone. Thank you.
The first speaker, Naman, spoke for 3 minutes and 43 seconds. The second speaker, Hana, spoke for 3 minutes and 31 seconds. I would now like to invite Vidhan Sharma from Scottish High School to speak for the motion.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I, Vidhan Sharma of Scottish High International School, will speak for the motion there should be no restrictions on freedom of speech. Before I begin, however, I want you all to close your eyes. Go on, close them. Now imagine to yourself a world where you cannot speak your mind. Imagine saying things which are socially acceptable, even if they're completely contrary to your beliefs. Imagine hiding your thoughts, your feelings, always spouting pleasant lies. Imagine going to work one day and finding that a colleague or a friend had disappeared because he dared to say something which was considered wrong by the government. Now open your eyes. Scary, isn't it? You may be thinking I just made this up, that's all fiction. It's not fiction. This was cold, harsh reality for Nazi Germany and is the cold, harsh reality for the Chinese even today. One of the first things to go in these nations is the right and freedom to express oneself. Speech is not a feature solely restricted to man, but we made use of it to skyrocket to the top of the food chain, split the atom, go to the moon, and it's what has made it possible for me to speak here today. Another thing which made it possible for me to speak here today is the fact that we live in a democracy where human rights are championed and celebrated, where every person has the right to speak his or her mind. The fact is, democracy can just not function properly without freedom of speech. Now, some of you argue that while there should be some freedom of speech, there should also be certain restrictions in place. I beg to differ, and not on any moral grounds. This is a practical, highly sensible reason for not restricting it. And that reason lies in our understanding of the human psyche. It has been proven time and time again that denying something to humans will always result in them coveting it even more. Therefore, it's not only going to cause resentment in people if they aren't allowed to say certain things, it may also cause them to do it whenever there isn't any authority watching them. That is a very dangerous condition for a nation to be in, where the citizens become furtive and begin hiding things from the government, because that threat is the security of state. To place restrictions then is quite suicidal for everyone in the end. My point here is we don't have to place restrictions on people's freedom of speech. We can turn those restrictions into moral obligations, not legal ones. So let's commit to the right thing. Let's allow freedom of speech to be absolute, with controls being self-imposed rather than imposed by the state. Let's make this world a liberal utopia, not a totalitarian hell. To conclude, I'd just like you to imagine one final thing. Imagine being in China and saying, "Down with Xi Jinping." Thank God for freedom of speech. Now, for my rebuttal. A lot of speeches have emphasized that hate speech hurts the sentiments of others and still takes place. I'd just like you to remind you all of one simple fact. Many people have mentioned Article 19 of the Constitution, but there is a sub-article that also restricts these things from happening, and yet they do happen. What then is the point of restrictions that don't even work? If you suggest that the government begins cracking down hard on such things, you just move this world towards a totalitarian hell where people are suppressed and unable to express their mind because the government forbids them from doing so. If you begin punishing impulsive speeches because they hurt certain sentiments, at the end of the day, we just have to make an important choice: a liberal utopia with some chaos or a well-ordered totalitarian dump. The previous speaker said that Mark Antony, through his speech, led to a lot of bloodshed and war. But didn't he help those killers come to justice as well? So didn't he use his freedom of speech for a good thing? Thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite Swarnika Joshi of Scottish High School to speak against the motion.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today I, Swarnika Joshi from Scottish High International School, will be arguing against the motion there should be no restrictions on freedom of speech. Just because you have freedom of speech doesn't mean you can shout fire in a crowded theater. The right of freedom of speech should be under reasonable restrictions to maintain public order. The Constitution of India gives its citizens a right to freedom of speech, which is defined under Article 19(1)(a). It means everyone has a right to express their views or thoughts freely. However, this right is not absolute, and there are restrictions on grounds such as security of state, defamation, and hate speech. In the case of security of state, the government has put restrictions on the activities that affect it. Freedom of speech concerning an individual, if he is promoting the commission of a crime or violence, would undermine state security, and therefore restrictions should be placed on that individual. Does the right of freedom of speech allow you to hurt the religious sentiment of someone else? An act done in the name of freedom of speech by French magazine Charlie Hebdo's in 2006 was in fact a freedom to insult, according to the Muslim community. They published the cartoons of a highly revered personality in Islam, Prophet Muhammad. This act is not only forbidden in Islam, but also caused many Muslims to suffer emotional pain and resentment at such an open exhibition of hatred in the name of freedom of expression. Freedom of speech is a fundamental human right. However, if that right hurts someone else's ideas, then whose thoughts and rights are to be given precedence? Although the terrorist attack on the magazine is equally condemnable and cannot be justified in any case, had the magazine exhibited some responsibilities in the usage of freedom of expression, this world would have escaped a horrific terror attack. I would agree that there should be no restrictions on freedom of speech, but only if we lived in an ideal world where everyone is open-minded and respected everyone else's opinions without being negatively influenced. The problem is that we live in a world where there are serious conflicts over opposing opinions, which can lead to social disharmony and violence. Freedom of speech could also lead to hate speech. A prime example of this can be seen on social media, which today is a hotbed of toxic and hateful conversations. Hate speech leads to extreme views and violence. In 2019, a terrorist opened fire in 2 mosques and that killed 49 worshippers in Christchurch, New Zealand. The attack was live streamed on Facebook by the perpetrator. The aftermath of such terror attacks led to a new debate about how we need to curtail hate speech on the internet. The right of freedom of speech is not absolute. There should not be a narrow or condensed interpretation of freedom of speech, but that does not mean that there cannot be any limit. Restrictions are necessary to maintain the security of state, public order, and social harmony. For my rebuttal, I would like to point out that my worthy opponent mentioned that the Constitution of India gives everyone the right to freedom of speech. However, reasonable restrictions on grounds such as public order, violence, and national security are also mentioned under the same article in our Constitution. My opponent also mentioned social media and how a very small fraction of our population has access to it. However, more than 40% of our 1.5 billion population has access to the internet and social media and are free to post whatever they like without any concern for others' thoughts, beliefs, and rights. Hence, it is necessary to have reasonable restrictions that don't stifle our right to speak, but prevent us from stepping on others' rights and thoughts. Thank you.
I would like to thank both speakers for their speeches. The first speaker, Vidhan, spoke for 3 minutes and 32 seconds. The second speaker, Swarnika, spoke for 3 minutes and 47 seconds. I would now like to invite Anvi Singh Rana from DPS Vasant Kunj to speak for the motion.
Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to the conscience, said John Milton. Good morning, honorable judges, teachers, and my dear friends. The subject for today's debate is there should be no restrictions on freedom of speech. I, Anvi Singh Rana from DPS Vasant Kunj, shall be speaking in favor of the motion. Flipping through history, we see that freedom of speech and expression has been the heart of all democracies from as early as the 5th or 6th centuries. Today, most countries have laws to protect freedom of speech as a human right. Freedom of speech, according to Milton, is a multifaceted right that includes the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas. The UN Declaration states the right to freedom of speech and expression as a human right. My opponent may say that restrictions on freedom of speech is vital for maintaining the social and moral fabric, but I choose to disagree. I would like to ask my opponent that if citizens are responsible enough for electing representatives for framing national and international laws, are they so reckless that they need checks to decide when, what, or how to express ideas and opinions? I would also like to assert that it is unfair to use rare, standalone cases to impose a complete curb on freedom of speech. We have an experience on restrictions of freedom of speech during the British rule of India and the imperial conquests of so many other nations. We do not wish to go back to those barbaric times. If we were to remain rooted in the past, will our modern world ever be progressive? Definitely not. Why should any government stifle freedom of speech? If we did not enjoy freedom of speech, we would not have assembled here for today's debate. The famous words of Gandhiji come to mind. Be the change you wish to see in the world. Without freedom of speech, you would only be a silent spectator. Freedom of speech allows you to articulate your thoughts, share ideas, and watch the world open out arms to embrace them, thus setting the motion the much needed change, the change for a better tomorrow. With that, I'd like to rest my case. Thank you. I would like to begin with my rebuttal by quoting Frederick Douglass. Restricting the right to freedom of speech is a double wrong. It violates the right of the speaker as well as that of the hearer. My opponent has painted a bleak picture that shows that people are so insensitive to others' thoughts and feelings that they need to be restricted from freedom of speech. But I would like to ask my opponent that if freedom of speech is so insignificant that it should be brushed aside, why does it deserve a sacrosanct place as one of the 7 fundamental rights in India? Why is it not instead a fundamental duty? Thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker for their speech and now invite Manat Buddhiraja of DPS Vasant Kunj to speak against the motion.
The difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between the lightning and the lightning bug, proclaimed Mark Twain. Honorable jury, teachers, and my fellow participants, as we gather in this house today, I, Manat Buddhiraja of Class 7, stand firmly against the motion. Do you think that a society with unrestricted freedom of speech will allow people to live fruitfully? Undoubtedly, the answer is a loud and clear
No. As society evolves, we must decide and differentiate that every single right comes with a responsibility, and that is the responsibility that I am upholding today. Hate speeches, trolling, and body shaming are rising uncontrollably in our community because of the absence of defined controls. Civil society desperately yearns. Civil society desperately yearns to curb the ever increasing and polluting verbal diarrhea to preserve the humanity in it. Violations of the corresponding responsibility that comes with every right can spread mistrust, unease, and even create insurgency, causing the unimaginable pain that defined legislations can spare us. Targeted attacks on minorities, slanderous statements aimed at a particular culture. Tell me, does this mirror the utopia that we dream of? My opponent may state that people will exercise their rights with proper freedom and with proper caution. But I would like to state that if society was so ideal, so civilized, so educated, and so literate, then why do we get thousands of news of murder and rape and sexual abuse? Our society is in no way developed, civilized, or even close to being at the level where freedom of speech is exercised with proper caution. In a country like India, with a vast, diverse, multicultural population, one hate speech, one improperly posed sentence could damage the foundations of our society, and our society will come crumbling down. In order to save the fabric and protect our society, we must implement restrictions on freedom of speech. As the Supreme Court ruled in the Subramaniam Swamy versus Union of India case in 2016, the right to freedom of speech is not absolute and is balanced with the other person's right to reputation. In conclusion, I state that the balance achieved by restrictions on free speech is essential to sustain harmony, vital to the survival and progress of the individual, the society, and the world. I would now like to begin with my rebuttal. My opponent stated that when we implement restrictions on freedom of speech, we would edge closer and closer to losing the essence of democracy. But I would like to rebut that by saying that we will impose responsible restrictions on freedom of speech and will no way limit people's power to speak against the government. Also, the implementation of rules against freedom of speech in monarchies or communist countries like China is very different from the state in a democracy and cannot be compared. Thank you.
I would like to thank the speakers for their speeches. The first speaker, Anvi, spoke for 4 minutes. The second speaker, Manat, spoke for 3 minutes and 46 seconds. I would now like to invite Anvita Sahu from the Shiv Nadar School to speak for the motion.
Voltaire, an 18th century French author, said, "I do not agree with what you have to say, but I'll defend to death your right to say it." A very warm morning to all students, judges, and teachers present here. My name is Anvita Sahu from Shri School, Gurugram, and I will be speaking for the motion. Freedom of speech is a right given to us by the government. The right to express is a focal point, a fundamental right in different countries, including India. This right has been utilized to give justice to the citizens of the country. Also, it has been targeted innumerable times with blows and answers to questions which were never asked. Adding restrictions to the right will be like telling a person that they will find directions to their destination across the road as they cross it, and then blinding them the next very second. A popular example of how freedom of speech is important in a country can be the ongoing farmer protests in India. For the benefit of the farmers, the legislature released a bill. However, the farmers didn't quite agree with what the government had to say. They used their freedom to express and their freedom to protest and spoke up against the central powers. Their struggles bore a sweet fruit. The government withdrew the bill. This proves how the voices and the liberty to express our views is important in a democracy, as without this fundamental right, in a especially important sense, the state disappears, questioning both the rights of citizens and ruling powers of the country. According to Article 19 of the Indian Constitution, any Indian citizen has the right to freedom of speech and expression. Adding limitations to that right will go against the law. The media, for example, are the representatives of most, if not all, the citizens of India. They demand answers to questions which we as common people are scared to ask. They evoke their right to freedom of speech and help us get answers. How can we forget social media when we are talking about the right to express? A key example is the Me Too movement, which helped thousands across the globe. Victims of sexual abuse believe themselves to be in an environment where they can speak up against their offenders and get justice. Even in courtrooms, if there is a case and a group of people don't agree with the final decision taken by the judge, then they speak up against it, and in few instances, the case restarts. I think the freedom of speech shouldn't be restricted as it hasn't had the best of consequences in history. For example, Martin Luther King Jr., he spoke up for the rights of all African Americans in the United States, past all the barriers of restrictions laid upon them by the government. And by using the right properly, he healed most of the scars given to the African Americans by the people of the country. Another example can be the British oppressed Indians in the 19th century. Adding restrictions to the speeches and thoughts of Indians led to countless riots and protests, outcomes of which were nasty. If the citizens had not spoken up against the controlling ways of the British government, then absolute freedom would have been a dream too. My opponent stands firmly against the topic, demanding restrictions to a right which allows people to state ideas and views on society. Well, if there were restrictions to freedom of speech, then half the people here wouldn't dare to say half of what they're saying right now. To sum it all up, limiting a person's speaking right will make them question all the laws of the government. This may lead to both violent and non-violent approaches, and it's obvious that neither will look pretty. Adding restrictions to the right to express will be like cutting off an important organ of the body and expecting it to function, the body being the country. Thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker for that outstanding speech. I now invite Niharika Chaudhary of the Shiv Nadar School to speak against the motion.
Good morning. My name is Niharika and I will be going against the motion. I am a crusader for freedom of speech in every walk of life. However, I'm also a firm believer of living harmoniously in a diverse society, which is why I believe we should have limits to how far free speech can go. In a world with increasingly polarized political, religious, and ethnic opinions, freedom of speech is a victim of abuse. In alarming frequency, we see people misuse this right to spread hatred. For example, Hitler's abuse of this very right of freedom of speech resulted in the mass ethnic cleansing of the Jews. Are 6 million casualties a suitable payment for unrestricted freedom of speech? Right to freedom of speech is thus a privilege, yet it is often exploited. It is vital, therefore, to have necessary deterrence to prevent any form of hate speech, misinformation, or extremism which can manipulate public emotion. We have seen politicians, religious leaders, and the public indulge in all of the aforementioned in the past. The deterrents are not aimed to silence any community, nor will it prevent people from expressing their opinions. Their goal is to prevent any statements or moves that may incite violence. They should have an agreed upon limit and be in place for any and all violations, regardless of caste, gender, race, or political power and influence. And some may argue that people have enough sense to know what qualifies as extremism and what doesn't. Well, the current global portrait doesn't paint a good picture. If people did know their limits, we wouldn't have anti-religious, homophobic, racist, and sexist protests, or vandalism of properties, or people who disregard the freedom movement be awarded Padma Shris. What we would have is a picture of decency and civility to reach a logical solution, which isn't the case globally. And in the event that a government is biased, it is vital to remember that our country is a democracy, not a dictatorship. This means people have the right to change laws that are unjust. A brilliant example is the farmers' protest. It should cement itself as a reminder that the government may have power in the parliament, but we will always have the main power as citizens. Once again, the right to freedom of speech shouldn't and cannot be throttled. It can only have reasonable restrictions agreed upon by the people. And as my final word, I ask you this. Rather have a world where laws allow you to express your opinions in a civilized form, or a world where you can exploit this right to propagate hatred and watch that hatred shake the very foundations of society. I now come to my rebuttals. My worthy opponent mentioned how the citizens of our country are capable of electing a government and are thus capable of being sensitive. While that point is valid, I would like to remind everyone of the anti-CAA protests last year, which resulted in the vandalism of numerous properties, both homes and religious properties, and loss of lives. These restrictions will not silence anyone. It will prevent hate speech, misinformation, and extremism, all of which may incite violence. It was never about stopping people from expressing their opinions, but about allowing people to express their opinions in a civilized, compassionate way. And yes, we do have instances of oppressive governments throttling critics' voices. However, the main culprits are often dictatorial governments like Russia and China, who also get away with a lot worse. In democracies like the USA and India, which are the world's largest, in the long run, despite short lived consequences, owing to constitutional remedies, the people always triumph. Thank you.
I would like to thank the speakers for their speech. The first speaker, Anvita, spoke for 3 minutes and 38 seconds. The second speaker, Niharika, spoke for 3 minutes and 46 seconds. I would now like to invite Anika Gopal from the Sanskriti School to speak in favor of the motion and complete the rebuttal in 1 minute.
Niharika from Shivnadar School, my opponent, had an amazing speech, but as the saying goes, every argument has a lot of scope for questioning. First of all, there should be no limits to freedom of speech as everyone has a right to voice their opinions. And this right should and cannot be taken away from them or limited. Because like she said, this country is a democracy and lots of the countries in this world are democracies too. You can legislate us on the basis of what we do, but not what we say and think. Everything is our opinion and that cannot be limited. And we are allowed to express our beliefs totally with no exceptions as the Constitution and Preamble says. Then, the freedom of information in Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution says we have freedom to information with no exceptions, which means suppose we say that the government is planning something against China, then we will be put in jail because this is crossing the limits of freedom of speech by saying something like this. But suppose it is true, should we be punished for saying the truth? Because this is freedom of information and it is in the Constitution with no limits. She also said that people misuse the ability of freedom of speech. She also gave Hitler as her example. Now, is it fair to judge the future and laws of the world according to what people do? One person, two people? Is it fair to judge us and prevent us from freedom because you compared us with other people? Everyone is not like Hitler. She also spoke about people being abused because they are on the receiving end of our free speech. When we think about how hurt they will be, does no one think about how hurt we will be when we are not allowed to express our own opinions? When you go to graveyards, you see graves, but you see things which are not seen. And that is the ideas that have died with those people. In their lifetime, before they died, everyone in the graveyards, why did they not show the world their ideas? The world could have become a much better place. Because there was no freedom at that time, and now there are limits. With that, I hope I've been able to rebut Niharika from Shivnadar School.
I would like to thank the speaker for their speech, inviting Anvesha Singh from the Sanskriti School, who spoke against the motion, to complete their rebuttal in 1 minute.
I would like to rebuttal Anvita Sang from Shivnadar School, who went for the motion. Anvita said that in India, many people have been given justice through freedom of speech. But I would like to mention that Indian Constitution has restrictions to complete freedom under Article 19 of Part 3. So she herself said that justice has still been provided. Therefore, it's visible that even with restrictions, justice is being provided, and absolute freedom to speech is in the actual key to fair play. Thank you.
I would like to thank both speakers for their speech. The first speaker, Anika, spoke. Her rebuttal was for 2 minutes and 5 seconds, the total time adding up to 5 minutes and 12 seconds. And the second speaker, Anvesha, spoke, rebutted for 25 seconds, her total time now standing at 3 minutes and 20 seconds. I'd like to thank all the speakers for fantastic speeches. I'd like to invite our first judge, Ms. Sonia Singh, to give a few general comments to the speakers.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful morning, and it was very interesting because the topic of the debate is something that we debate every day as journalists as well. So it was wonderful to see what all you young people thought of it. And I was very impressed by the maturity of the views expressed this morning. And I thought that really when we say debate, I think also one of the essence of what we do today is that we seem to have forgotten the art of dialogue, and the core of dialogue is being able to listen to each other's arguments and then make up our minds. And I'm glad that though, of course, in debates, they're for and against motions, I thought the rebuttals were also interesting in where you acknowledge your opponent's view, take their points on board, and then rebut it in a way which illustrates why you don't agree with it. And as I said, what is important for all of us to know as a society is that we can agree to disagree in a civilized manner. I thought there were some very interesting points raised. I thought some of the participants who used the Constitution made good points there, because, of course, our right to freedom of speech is guaranteed under the Constitution, but even there are some reasonable restrictions, if you want to put it that way, where you don't go against the law of the land in freedom of speech. And I think that perhaps is a good parameter for all of us to judge just how far we can go in freedom of speech. I thought it was interesting that some of you traveled very far back in history for your quotes, and some of you looked at the more specific current examples. I thought the comparisons with China were very interesting. And again, I thought that the content was very good for all of you, actually. I thought the style varied, and perhaps that's something that all of you can work on, that while content is very important, it's also important to hold your viewer, your listener. And I thought the people who experimented a little with style were also very interesting. But just to say, overall, I really enjoyed it. You made me think. You made me question some presumptions. And I think that if you've done that, that's a debate successfully done. So well done, all of you.
I'd like to thank ma'am for those comments, and now invite the second judge, Mr. Sukumar Ranganathan, to give some general feedback to the speakers.
Hi, it was good fun listening to the debate, and it was interesting. Like Sonia said, this is a very relevant topic for our times. It's also a complex topic. So it's very interesting to see what young people think of it and how they approach it. As at least some of us know, current and future wars are all going to be fought over information and the control for information. And since we live in an age of peak information and so much data, there are far too many pulls and pressures, and some of these came across in the debate. And I thought some of the arguments were very sophisticated for students who are still in middle school. My advice to all of you is to, I'm sure you must have done a lot of reading for this debate, is to keep reading, because increasingly we find that the nuances of debate are being lost. And the importance of facts and information as the basis for a debate are also being lost. And so that is something that all of you need to focus on. You need to make sure that you don't lose what you've displayed today. Congratulations to the winners, and best wishes to everyone else. I think all of you did very well. I'm not sure that I could have spoken as well or strung together arguments as cogently when I was in middle school. So all credit to you and to your teachers. Thank you.
I would like to thank Sir for those comments, and now invite the third judge, Mr. Prachurja Furkan, to address the teams.
Thank you, Jay. Firstly, I would like to thank the Shri School Malsuri for giving me the opportunity to witness such a wonderful and brilliant debate. And it's an honor to be a part of a distinguished panel. Coming to the debate, I think most of the arguments being put forward by the teams were very good in terms of the content. But I'm someone who believes that content is something that always has room for improvement. So, I mean, something that Sukumar sir has suggested, to always read more, because debate is something that teaches you to learn. But the more important fact about debating is that it helps you to unlearn certain things and unlearn certain presumptions and assumptions that you had about a lot of things, right? In terms of style, I think I have no criticisms against. All of you were brilliant. All of you had cogent ways of putting forward your arguments. In terms of the content, I think there is room for improvement, such that what I do believe is that speech is something that is very relative, and the impact of a speech is very relative in terms of where you are speaking and where it is being said, because the outcome and the interpretation is multidimensional. Because is it being interpreted by the civil society? Is it being interpreted by the intellectual have-nots? Or is it being interpreted by the institutions of state? Or is it being interpreted by in different worlds? For example, if the West is very individualistic, but the East is a collective society, right? So in that sense, I think speech, the entire topic, is something that is very relative. And the mechanism, something that was missing in most of the speeches was probably the restrictions, because I think the structure of speech in a conventional speech is very important, and something that a few speakers did in terms of defining and bringing the context to your side, because it is very important to bring the context, to bring the house to your side and define it the way you see it. So in terms of the definitions, I think there can be a few more things that can be said. For example, the idea of restrictions was quite ambiguous. And for example, what are the mechanisms to address these restrictions? Are you talking about moral suasion, something that also has consequences? Or are you talking about institutional methods? So I think that ambiguity can be met in future debates. But all in all, I think it was very good. I was vicariously reliving my school life, trying to imagine what I would have said. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, Deb.
I would like to thank all the judges for their comments. And now moving on to the much awaited results. The most promising speaker of the Junior Shri Debate 2021 is Veda Kalra from Vasant Valley School. Congratulations. The second best speaker of the Junior Shri Debate 2021 is Vidhan Sharma from Scottish High International School. And the best speaker of this year's Junior Shri Debate is Kai Kubo from the Doon School. A massive congratulations to all the speakers. And now, moving on to the team awards. The second runners-up for this year is the Vasant Valley School, represented by Veda Kalra and Amira Kher. The runners-up for this year's Shri Debate is Scottish High International School, represented by Swarnika Joshi and Vidhan Sharma. And the best school and the winner of this year's Junior Shri Debate is the Doon School, represented by Kai Kubo and Harshal Makin. Congratulations to all the speakers on an incredible performance. And I would now like to invite the Vice Principal of the Shri Ram School, Malsari, Madhur Ma'am, for the vote of thanks.
Namaste, everyone. Reinvent, adapt, and persist are the buzzwords these days. And time and again, we at the Shri Ram School have shown the same spirit by casting the Junior Shri Debate in this new mold that you see today. I have to begin my vote of thanks by acknowledging this landmark moment and all the people who made it possible. Firstly, our heartfelt thank you to each and every team that participated today in the Junior Shri Debate. You made it happen. It is incredible how as adults we can learn so much from our children. Nowhere is this seen better than in a debate. And today too, we witness how young minds are capable of such critical and clear thinking about such important ideas. So congratulations to all the speakers, irrespective of whether you won or you didn't win. All of you were absolutely incredible. So 3 cheers to you all. Further, deep appreciation and gratitude is due to all our esteemed judges. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedules and being with us this morning. Your feedback, I'm sure, is very valuable for all the teams to keep raising the bar, and definitely it's a source of encouragement for all of us who are involved. A huge, huge, huge thank you to the organizing team from Shri Ram School of students and staff members who worked hard behind the scenes to organize the event today. Finally, I would like to thank Manika ma'am, our director, and Manisha ma'am for their encouragement and constant support throughout the tournament. It has been a scintillating morning of intense debating with the sharpest young minds battling each other. And we are truly indebted to all those who made it possible by organizing, participating, or simply watching. Thank you, one and all, and we look forward to hosting you all again next year, hopefully on campus. Stay safe, everyone. Namaste.
Could I now please request everyone to stand up for the national anthem? And in conclusion, I would like to thank and congratulate all the speakers for what was a great and inspiring set of speeches. Thank you.